Eagles Entertainment.
Eagle Eye in the Sky is fueled by Gatorade, the official sports drink of the Philadelphia Eagles.
Anything that moves, I don't care who it is. Let's go. Give me everything you got. Play fast, play hard. Let's beat these boys tonight in their house. It's party time. It's party time. Here we go. Touchdown!
You are listening to the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast. Now here's your host, Fran Duffy.
That's right, another week, and we are talking quarterbacks today as the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade, continues. I'm Fran Duffy, and as always, I think we've got a great show for you here on episode number 243. At the top of this week's show, we've got Chalk Talk, where I chat with a couple of guests this week and a couple of former NFL quarterbacks that took very different paths to the NFL. First up, I caught up with both these guys really at the Combine out in Indianapolis with the sole purpose of having a quarterback-centric episode this time of year. And first up, we've got Hall of Famer Kurt Warner. Now, former undrafted free agent, Northern Iowa, went on to be one of the best quarterbacks in modern history. Then we followed up with Brady Quinn. He was a first-round pick out of Notre Dame over a decade ago. And here's what I love about both of these guys is they are now outstanding analysts in today's game. Warner, obviously, with NFL Network covering the league. Brady Quinn is with Fox and SiriusXM covering the college game. I could not wait to talk with both these guys and pair them both together for a podcast. We covered some really good ground here on the show. So let's not waste any more time. Let's dive into our chat now. It's time for Chalk Talk.
Let's get down to business. It's time for Chalk Talk.
Well, really excited to welcome in really one of the best quarterbacks of all time, Kurt Warner, NFL Network analyst. Kurt, welcome to the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade.
Thank you. Good to be here.
So we're going to talk quarterback play and kind of where it's going in the NFL, where it's gone over the last few years. In your mind, what's the biggest change, say in the last decade, at the quarterback spot in terms of what you need to have success at that position?
Well, I would say I don't believe a whole lot's changed in what you have to be able to do to be successful, especially at the championship level.
Sure.
I still believe you have to be able to win games with your right arm. You got to be able to play within the pocket because I believe when you get to the playoffs and you play against good teams, they force you to do what you don't do well, or they force you to play from inside the pocket because they're good teams week in and week out. But I will say that I believe the imagination on how you can win at this level has changed. And the athleticism piece has been added to the quarterback position maybe different than any time we've ever seen it in the history of our game. And so people are starting to understand that you can get guys, because let's be honest, there's not 32 guys in the world that are Tom Brady, Drew Brees, Aaron Rodgers type level where every team in the NFL can have one of those guys.
Sure.
There's just not those guys out. There's not enough of those guys out there. So now we got to go, okay, what if we don't have one of those guys?
Yeah.
How can we win in this business? And so the imagination has been opened with guys like Lamar Jackson and Russell Wilson to say, hey, we can win other ways. We can win with guys that aren't just pure pocket passers, that aren't just those guys that can pick you apart with their accuracy. There's other ways to be successful. And so now it opens up the pool and it opens up the minds of these scouts and these teams to go, okay, we don't have that guy, but let's look at these next tier guys or this next group that's coming up and say, he may not have, all the pieces to be a pocket passer, but what combination does he have that we can build around to become a successful team? Now, I still think we've got to see how many of those guys, if they don't ever become the good pocket passers, can win championships. I think you can win. I don't think there's any question about that. I mean, Lamar Jackson is a great example last year. I mean, wins the MVP, and they were, as good as anybody in the league. But then you get to the playoffs, and it's like, okay, we're playing against another good team, and they're going to force me to do some of the things that maybe aren't my strongest skill set. Can I do that at a championship level? And that becomes the real question for those next group of guys that, can they consistently play at that level and beat those good pocket passers or those teams that can score with whatever brand of football they play?
Sure.
And so that's, to me, still the next question is can those guys and those teams that play that way be championship-type teams year in and year out with that sort of play, or do they have to develop a little bit more? But there's no question you can win. You can play at a high level. You can win MVPs playing the quarterback position differently. I just don't know if we've seen championships won that way quite yet, and I think that's the next step in the progression.
How do you view that as being connected to offensive line play and where that's gone over the last few years? Because I think every team is looking, for the most part, is looking to improve their offensive line, and how that's affected what they need at the quarterback spot.
Well, I mean, I think it's twofold. I think there's times that it can definitely help your offensive line because you build in RPOs, which play to the benefit of giving your team an advantage. You can do a lot of movement stuff. You know, the run game, again, I go back to the Ravens because they're so different. Yeah. That run game with Lamar Jackson gives you an advantage in that perspective. But I think there's times that it can also hurt you. When a guy's extremely mobile and always looking to move and get out of the pocket, it can make it really hard on an offensive line, whereas a guy like me that was a statue back there that said, hey, I'm going to be right here, guys. I'm going to be at 9 yards, right in the middle of this pocket all day long, so just keep them away from here. You know, that can simplify things for an offensive line. So, again, I think there's pluses and minuses to both. There's positive and negatives to both. But again, the bottom line is I still believe offensive line have to block the pocket. They have to be able to block for drop back quarterbacks, just like I believe quarterbacks have to be able to play in the pocket. And so now when you add athleticism into it, sometimes that can be hard to be really good at both skill sets. And so it becomes, you know, what are we building around? What becomes most important for us at the quarterback position, at the offensive line position, with running backs as well? You know, you're doing more of the zone reads and the RPOs. We got to have a guy that can go sideways as opposed to just down. You know, all those things kind of change the way, because, I mean, how many great players do you know that can do all of those things equally well? You don't usually have them. So you got to pick a guy and go, okay, is this tackle better than this tackle? Well, now what are we going to do, and what are we going to ask them to do, and which one fits better with our quarterback? And so, you know, it can make it more complicated as well, even though it can, you know, allow you to be successful in different ways.
So when you look at the way that defenses now are trying to attack the quarterback and trying to attack offensive lines, you're seeing a lot more speed along the defensive line. You're seeing a lot more athletic interior rushers. As a former quarterback, and you're watching these guys that, you know, the Aaron Donalds and the Chris Joneses and Fletcher Coxes, those guys that have that quick twitch inside to be able to get into the quarterback's face. Do you kind of view that as like, man, I'd rather see that pressure come off the edge as opposed to right in front of me?
Never. You know, quarterbacks always say bring it off the edge. Great edge rushers are great, but I can set a point and I can let my tackle wash him by me more than if a guy gets quick pressure up the middle. That screws everything up, you know, because no matter how talented you are, you can be Patrick Mahomes, Aaron Rodgers, but technique is vital for a quarterback to consistently be accurate no matter what level you play at, no matter how talented you are. And so when a guy gets quick pressure up the middle, that forces technique to get away from you. No longer are you playing in a perfect world, and you've got to figure out a way to make throws where your technique gets away from you a little bit. And so I have always said that. You give me a pocket to step up into, I'll be just fine. We'll be able to function. You don't give me that pocket to step up into, it changes everything. And so the Aaron Donalds, the Warren Sapps back when I played, those were the guys that give you fits because they force quarterbacks to play out of rhythm. And, you know, even if you're in a run game and you're in the RPO, any of that stuff, if you force a quarterback to play out of rhythm, it changes everything. If they can sit back there and do what they want to do, a lot of these guys can be successful. So I would much rather take a dominant interior defensive force than even a great pass rusher on the edge.
Interesting. We're recording this on the day that the quarterbacks are going to work out at the NFL Scouting Combine. And, you know, a lot of people, when they're talking about projecting these guys to the NFL, it's about trying to figure out, okay, what are things that can improve with these guys and what are things that can't? And, you know, obviously we know about the physical stuff. You know, you're not going to become too much of a better athlete. Your arm can get a little bit better in terms of your lower body mechanics, but it's not going to get too much better. More on the mental side, I'd love to hear what are things that you feel just can't get a lot better from the mental and the psychological part of playing the position?
Well, see, here's the hard thing, and why I think it's so hard to judge and evaluate quarterbacks is that we never know what a player's ceiling is. You know, we throw that word around all the time, like, hey, he's got a high ceiling. No, you have no idea what his ceiling is. You know, his ceiling is whatever he can reach. And I'm a firm believer that great quarterbacks are quarterbacks that have the ability to evolve every year. You know, that they get better and better as time goes by.
Sure.
Lesser quarterbacks are guys that find that ceiling much sooner. Like I've seen guys that hit their ceiling in college. And so you get to the pros and you think, oh, well, gosh, they were this good in college. They're just going to get better, and who knows what we're going to get.
Right.
And then they get to the NFL and they're the same guy that they were in college. Then there's other guys that get there and they make progression for a year or two, and they get a little bit better, and they become solid quarterbacks in the NFL. But all of a sudden they say stop growing. They stop getting better. And then the great ones are the ones that, my gosh, how can Tom Brady and Peyton Manning continue to get better every single year? Yet they do. They evolve, and they find ways to push the envelope and get better at whatever that nuance is. Is it technique? Maybe. Is it the mental side of things? Is it the ability to see? Is it the knowledge of everything that's going on so they're able to slow the game down? But that's the hard thing, is I don't know what a player's ceiling is. You can't gauge that on anything.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it really, really hard, is that we want to, and we want to say, well, he only played 1 year in college, so, gosh, I mean, if he played 4, he would be better than he played 1. So, man, he's got plenty of room to – but we don't really know. And that, to me, is the fascinating part, is as I watch guys get into the league, it's impossible for me to project any of these guys and go, oh, they were good in college, they'll be good in the pros. I have no idea.
Right.
What you try to project is once they get there, okay, can they continue to get better? How can they continue to get better? But that's the hard part, is you never know. You never know what the capacity of a guy's brain and mind and football, mentality is until you see it.
Yep.
And it's why it's 50-50 with number one, picks, quarterbacks, is like, this guy going to be good or is he going to be a bust?
Right.
We have no idea. And, why? Because we had no idea when we put him at this level against the greatest in the world, with all this stuff flying at him, what he was going to do in that moment, and could he take what he was year 1 and be better year 2 and better year 5 and better year 10. And so, we're going to sit here and try to evaluate these guys forever, and we're never going to know until we actually see them between the lines on a Sunday afternoon, and we got to see what they become.
Yeah, I always go back to that quote from Bill Belichick: "Talent sets the floor, character sets the ceiling." Talking about projecting these guys in the NFL, so much unknown, especially for us on the outside in the media.
Right.
We don't get that access to those guys. Well, Kurt, really appreciate the time here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. We'll talk to you soon.
All right, sounds good.
Great stuff from Kurt, and I thought we covered some really interesting things there. First off, I thought what he said about technique being so pivotal at the position, that was spot on. I really love what he said, too, about the threat of interior pressure as a quarterback versus edge pressure. We've had this conversation in the past, but to me, that's what has always made Fletcher Cox so valuable, because he's one of a handful of defensive tackles in the league right now who consistently is able to create that instant pressure inside, and that's a play wrecker. I thought Kurt hit on that point really, really well, and then I love what he said as well about trying to trying to project these guys to the NFL, how we never quite know what a guy's ceiling is. We talk so often about a player's intangibles and how important they are, and Kurt highlighted why. If you don't have that work ethic, if you don't have that drive to constantly be working on your craft, it's tough to push past that current level of play and get better. Now, a part of that is that you have to have the right cast of characters around you to reach that ceiling as well, right? You need the coaching staff, the scheme. You need the pass catchers and those targets on the receiving end of your passes. You need the offensive line to give you time, all of that. So that's one of a handful of topics that I caught up with Brady Quinn about out in Indianapolis. Here's that interview now. We're really excited to welcome into the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade, former Notre Dame star, former NFL quarterback, Brady Quinn. Brady, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about quarterbacks today, and just the projection of those guys from college to the NFL. Obviously, not that long ago, you went through this whole process.
Yeah.
We're here at the Combine. The first time you came back, did it kind of bring you back to that you going through this process?
Yeah, it did, and it also just showed how much it's grown, and it's really become an event. Like you used to say, a primetime event. Now, literally, it is a primetime event. So you saw that. You saw how different it is for the media and the exposure. I mean, back when I came through the Combine, there was one room. It was like everyone kind of huddled in that. You ran up, you did your deal, you went off that. You're hurrying up and waiting to everything else, which I don't think that's changed, but just how much bigger the event's been made, and then really how much more access to, I think, fans and people with the media have as to everything that's taking place over the course of it.
So the one part that they don't have the access to is the stuff that used to happen at night. Now it happens during the day. Like the interview process. What was that like for you? Was it what you had expected coming into it?
It varied depending on the team.
Yeah.
The testing too, even at times. I mean, everyone knows about the Wonderlic, but there's also, the Redskins had, I want to say it was like Dr. Harry Wax, I think was his name, something like that. And you do all these different kind of tests.
Right.
You had these like different pegs on a board, and you had to figure out how to essentially end up with like one left or eliminate like half of them or something like that.
Sure.
There's different tests that they would take you through. So that process was always interesting to think, like, what are they taking away from this that's going to be applicable to playing the game of football or as a quarterback, how you think or how you learn.
Right.
And so those tests are always interesting. But, yeah, I mean, for the most part, it hasn't changed that much. I think the interview process is always big just for these teams to get to know some of these players.
Sure.
It's one of the reasons why I think they extended the time. But, limiting the amount of exposure they get with some of these guys, it obviously puts more pressure on the scouting staffs, the coaches, to do their due diligence.
Yeah, and that's what happens. Also in the media, we hear there's a report, this guy didn't do well in interviews. But since all those teams do things differently, like one guy may walk into one room and, he aced this one and he didn't do well here, you're going to get different reports.
And it all depends on how you're going to end up being tested, right?
Yeah.
Like I remember sitting in a room with Jason Garrett, and back at this point in time, he's the offensive coordinator for the Dallas Cowboys.
Right.
And so we sat down, and he took out a dry erase board. He would draw up a play, tell me what the play was, what to read, etc. He'd erase it and go draw it back, explain it to me. We did that for 15 minutes straight.
Yeah.
And that was it.
That was it.
And, he came away, and obviously, like, I knew everything. I think at the end, he actually asked a couple questions, like, all right, show me your favorite red zone play, show me your favorite third down play, take me through, blah, blah, blah. So, we'd go through all that kind of stuff. And then and after that was kind of it. And that's the odd thing is you kind of walk it over and thinking, all right, like, there wasn't like a point where I ever got hung up. It wasn't like I couldn't explain something.
Sure.
I hope it went well.
Right.
They didn't draft me. Actually, I think they traded out of the spot with the Browns. With the Browns traded up to get me. So it ended up working out that way. But they didn't need a quarterback at the time anyways. I think they had Romo around that time.
Sure. So let's get in now into the actual projection, guys getting into the NFL, get out of the combine process. What is one part of it that you feel doesn't get talked about enough in media and fans don't know, is really, really important to that projection?
No, it's not about the projections. It's the situation and circumstance they entered into.
Yeah, right. No question.
One of the talking points and conversations that you're having right now is because everyone's speculating Joe Burrow's going to be the #1 overall pick is if he wants to go to Cincinnati.
Right. Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And the reason being is because there's a perception that the Bengals organization isn't one of the better organizations in the NFL. And if you're Joe Burrow and you want to have the best chance of winning a Super Bowl and succeeding, being in a good organization plays a part of that. I'm sure Carson Wentz would tell you that. He got drafted to a great organization.
Right.
So that is one of the things where you could take a guy who maybe isn't the most talented or the best quarterback in that draft, but you put him on a good football team, they can win a Super Bowl. Joe Flacco entered in a great situation with the Baltimore Ravens. Matt Ryan, a great situation with the Atlanta Falcons. And that can drastically change their career, especially guys who are more prototypical pocket passers. If they didn't have the offensive line, the defense, run game, different things to help them out, especially early on, or guys to throw to like a Julio Jones, it drastically changes the beginning of their career and then how they're perceived moving forward.
No question. Patrick Mahomes doesn't go to Kansas City, and he ends up in Arizona playing behind that offensive line where Josh Rosen had to deal with.
As good as Patrick Mahomes is, he's not the NFL MVP his first year starting on the Arizona Cardinals.
Right.
It's just a fact.
Yeah.
And so you look at even his baptism into the NFL, if you will, to be able to sit behind Alex Smith, who's a franchise guy, one of the best people in the business, to learn from how he does things, even though they're not the same player.
Right.
To learn from him, to absorb the system, really not have to do anything until the last game of the season, start week 17, and see all that. And then the next year, have it be his team with Andy Reid, all the pieces they have. It's a perfect scenario for the next 2 years they've gone how they've gone.
Sure.
MVP, Super Bowl MVP, and winning the Super Bowl. So, that's your ideal situation, not only because he's a ridiculous talent, maybe a generational talent, but it's also a perfect situation for him to enter into how it's worked for him.
Yeah, one of the things we talk about a lot on the show is the evolution of the game, really, and I almost go back, there's a lot of talk now about the new CBA and everything, go back to the last CBA. Really, you talk about the offensive line play and how that's kind of gone downhill and how that's changed things for the quarterback. And now you kind of look for some different things, I feel like, with quarterbacks.
Yeah.
Athleticism is at a premium now. You have to be able to get yourself out of trouble.
You have to be able to move. It's some of that. it's threefold. So some of that scheme,
Yeah.
right? You've got to be able to have a coach that understands that now the biggest difference between athletes on the field or the worst matchup is your D-line versus your O-line. You know, your offensive line, the shape and size of those guys hasn't changed a ton.
Yeah.
The D-line has changed drastically, right? Now you have edge rusher guys who are like 245 pounds sometimes coming off the edge versus that same 310-pound offensive tackle, maybe 320.
Yeah.
So, you know, they've gotten smaller faster, and then even the interior guys have gotten better, right? Some of those guys have not necessarily gotten smaller, but just better being one-gap penetrators, Aaron Donalds, Chris Jones, et cetera.
Right.
We saw the NASCAR package back with the Giants when that became really popular.
Sure.
Now teams do it all the time. They move down the defensive ends in the D-tackle spots. They bring in the other edge rushers, and it's just speed. It's straight speed. So you have to be able to scheme around that, and having some quarterback run, having some quarterback moving stuff eliminates some of that. You touched on the offensive line issue. That's a systematic issue that we're finding from high school to college to the NFL.
Yeah.
More spread offenses, less guys in three-point stance, less, you know, offensive linemen firing off, taking the attack to them. So those guys don't have the ability to be on the offensive versus the defensive line. So that becomes an issue if you're moving laterally or backwards more often than not, right?
Do you feel like that's why RPOs have become more and more popular for, you know, starting obviously at the lower level, just because now it's like
they're more popular at the college level because it's a rule that needs to be changed.
Yeah, right.
But being able to have an ineligible blocker 3 yards downfield, which, and let's be honest, in college football, sometimes those guys are like 3.5.
Right.
I mean, do the math. You're talking about
They're running
like
a stick route.
10 feet downfield,
Right,
and like
yeah.
the linebacker's got to make a decision whether it's a run or a pass. Are you
Right.
kidding me?
Yep.
And so the NFL level, it's to a degree you see it, but it's harder to only being a yard downfield. And obviously the officiating is even better at the NFL level. So it's part of it. What it's eliminated is it's a way of trying to make the defense play slower. Eliminating maybe that really good edge rusher where now you're forcing that guy to freeze and read, is it a run, is it a pass, how you play. But it's eliminated quick game. Like now you don't see as much three-step anymore for that reason. But anyway, the offensive line development, I think that's something that's been lacking because of the systems that they're working within. And then the final piece is, bottom line, like, yeah, these guys have to be more athletic. They have to be able to move and create because of the disadvantage like we talked about earlier. So it's a prerequisite now, and it's harder and harder for you to build an offensive line to protect like a more prototypical pocket passer.
People talk about accuracy all the time with quarterbacks coming out. And when you look at guys, the accuracy, his ball placement, do you feel like that's something that can improve for a guy moving forward into the NFL, or is he kind of where he's at in that area?
No, I definitely feel like it can improve. There's a couple of things. I mean, fundamentally, you can look at some flaws in their technique. It could be, a lot of times it's their feet.
Yep.
Not too many times it's going to be their upper body mechanics. Those things have been ingrained and trained in their muscle memory at this point for thousands and thousands of reps. So that's kind of what it is. The feet and the base, those are things you really can work on. And then also, like your eyes, how you process.
Right.
The more confident you feel within an offense and where you're going with the football, the more confident you're going to be in that throw. And so it all starts in your head first, and then goes to your eyes. Your eyes has to be in the right place where you're throwing, right?
Sure.
And then if you can align your body and your feet, you give yourself a better chance to be accurate. So all those things are things you can, work to improve upon, but it takes time. And that's the biggest issue with the NFL is there's just not as much development anymore. And now that we've on the brink of new CBA, it sounds like the offseason is only going to get shorter.
Right.
So when are these guys really working on that? When are they able to get the instruction that they need?
Is there an area where you feel like a guy can't improve? Like what are some of the things, a quarterback, where what you see in college, that's really what he's going to be moving forward?
Like arm strength.
Yeah.
You can probably look at how they handle some clutch situations and say, okay, the guy just has a hard time dealing with the pressure and stress.
Right.
When you get into those scenarios in games. That's something that concerns me about Jordan Love this year. Watching back through his 2019 tape, it seemed like, look, he didn't have a great teammate around him.
Yeah.
But when he got down, he compounded some of those mistakes. You watch his opening game of the season versus Wake Forest. The pick that he ended up throwing that ended the game at that point when they're in field goal range.
Right.
One was a bad decision from that standpoint. And you could understand what he was doing. He had the flat. Instead, he was trying to go over top of the linebacker to get to a tight end, and the guy made a good catch. But honestly, that drive should have been killed before that because he threw up a ball into double coverage. That guy dropped. That was an easy interception.
Right.
So it's the decision in that game. It's the decision at the end of the LSU game when they're down, when it's like, okay, but we don't need to just start throwing the ball up to throw the ball up, right? And so those are things that, we saw in Jameis Winston in his last year at Florida State. And what's the issue with him now? Same thing.
Right, yep.
And so the decision-making, especially in pressure situations, those are the things that you want to be able to see clean, coming out. Otherwise, you worry about that in the NFL because it only is more pressure. It's only more stress added on.
When you look at a guy like Love, it's such a divisive topic because of what he was this past year versus
2 years
2018.
ago,
Like, you watch that Michigan State film and the best
Right.
opponent on their schedule, and I mean, he was lights out. Like,
Right.
as a evaluator, if you put your GM hat on, like, how do you read that situation?
It's funny. I actually think Patrick Mahomes has
Right.
forced everyone to reevaluate how they read at Jordan
Right.
Love.
Sure.
Because the knock on him was always not a winner.
Right.
I mean, that was the stupidest thing anyone's ever said. Because you looked at the fact that he had to put up like 600 yards passing a game because their defense was so bad at tag.
Right.
So he's forced a lot of people to reevaluate how they look at quarterbacks. With Jordan Love, there's a lot to like. I really like him as a prospect. He does need to have a strong understanding of the offense that he's running. That changed this past year. He's got the athletic tools that you're looking for. He can make some awkward body throws. I would say probably better than any of these guys. Like, you see him make some off-balance throws. And look, there's times when he goes to that too much and he kind of gets lazy with some of his footwork. But there's other times when you see him, he has clean feet. He snaps his hips around to work through progressions. He does a good job. So there's a lot of natural and raw ability there you can work with. And I think if he entered into a Kansas City Chiefs situation where he could sit for a year, learn, be in a good system like that, you could see him be a franchise guy.
Yeah, to me, like, watching him in that Michigan State game over the summer, like, that, like, they looked like Mahomes. You hate saying that and making that comparison, but like,
and the tough thing is, I think you have to unfortunately like look at some of those other Power 5 games.
Yeah, sure.
To compare, but I mean, Michigan State too was better defense 2 years ago. I mean,
Right.
when you take into that account,
Sure.
Mark D'Antoni team like that, there's a lot to like.
Well, Brady, really appreciate the time here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. Best of luck moving forward, and we'll
Thanks, Fran.
talk to you soon.
Yes, sir.
So that was great stuff there from Brady, and I love the insight into the interview process at the Combine. Anytime we can get anecdotal stories like that, I eat that up. I hope you guys enjoyed that as well. A couple of points from Brady that I'd love to hammer home here. First, I love the discussion about what's fixable and what's not at every position. And I love having those conversations with players, with former players, coaches, scouts. I love having those discussions because everybody has their own opinions and no one is really right or wrong. Everybody has really good points on it. So I love hitting on that discussion whenever possible. And I agree. I just happen to agree with what Brady said about accuracy. And it's not an easy conversation to have, right? Because, there are lots of guys coming out that simply just aren't accurate enough to make it in the NFL. But here's where these two interviews that we had today both come together, because without those intangibles that Kurt Warner talked about earlier, you don't improve on those weaknesses, right? So if a guy is just spraying the ball over the yard in college, right, he's not going to be Tom Brady. He's not going to be a pinpoint accurate passer, but because you're never going to see those guys go from one extreme to the other like that. But you can see guys make incremental improvement year over year. And both guys talked about how important mechanics factor into that equation. Now, the other thing I really loved from Brady was the conversation about Jordan Love. Now, I thought that was a really interesting one. Obviously, the Packers made headlines a couple of weeks ago during the NFL draft by trading up in the first round to take Jordan Love on the back end of round one. But I'll tell you what, this kid's talent is through the roof. We talked about him all the time over on the Journey to the Draft podcast going back to the summer. And to kind of continue that conversation with Brady a little bit into my own personal thoughts on evaluating the quarterback position, I think what he said about how everybody had to kind of rethink how they view the position after Patrick Mahomes, to me, like that's right into exactly how I feel about it. That's right across the bow for me. That hit exactly what I've gone through personally, because I remember watching Patrick Mahomes, and I could pull up the report on watching him coming out of Texas Tech. He had all of the arm talent in the world, not just velocity, but the ability to make all the throws. He was precise with his ball placement. His accuracy was outstanding. His touch was outstanding. He could make throws from every single arm angle and every single body position. It was insane watching him on film. But on the other hand, he was like a chicken with his head cut off every time he dropped back. Every snap of the ball, there was very little structure. He didn't have any sense of timing and rhythm within the structure of the offense with how he played. And I remember just kind of making the analogy that it was like all those old Western films where, he was this bucking bronco, this wild, crazy stallion that, the cowboy had to kind of rein in. And that's the role that Andy Reid had to play there, right? He had to come in and kind of rein in exactly what Patrick Mahomes is. And I remember thinking to myself, watching Patrick Mahomes at Texas Tech, man, there's just no way that this guy is going to ever learn to be able to play within rhythm in the NFL. And I was 100% wrong on that one. So first thing I've learned, don't deal in absolutes like that ever when you're talking about projecting guys to the NFL. And then when you get to the discussion of movement at the quarterback position, to me, look, I've done really a complete 180 on this. As you can tell from these two discussions, I brought it up with both Brady Quinn and with Kurt Warner. Let's bring this now to the Eagles, right? Because if I jumped back into the Wayback Machine and grabbed Fran Duffy of 2013 or of 2015 and brought him here today, and I watched Jalen Hurts at Oklahoma, I'm going to be honest, Fran Duffy of 5 years ago, of 8 years ago, would have struggled a bit projecting Jalen Hurts to the NFL. But go back to what Kurt Warner said at the top of the show. That trait of athleticism has gotten people to open up their imaginations when it comes to the position and when it comes to NFL offense. Kurt used Lamar Jackson as an example, but it's not just Lamar Jackson to me. I think you look at Josh Allen up in Buffalo. It's Cam Newton and what he's done over the last decade. It's Russell Wilson. It's Aaron Rodgers. People don't talk about Aaron Rodgers this way, but when you watch him over the last handful of years, he thrives outside of structure. That's where he lives. So much of his production has come when the play breaks down. He breaks the pocket and he has to create. And I'll use an analogy that Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks have used over on the Move the Sticks podcast just this offseason. And they've used it regarding Jalen Hurts specifically. Think of it like basketball. There are guys at the position who are shooters, like a Steph Curry, but then there are your scorers. Just get them the ball, like at the top of the arc, let them get the ball at the point, and just let them create, let them get to the rack. Maybe the jump shot isn't always great, but they're going to find a way to put the ball in the bucket. And to me, I think you look at Russell Wilson. He is a magician. I can think back, though, to watching Russell Wilson in 2014 and 2015. It's his third, fourth year in the league before he got paid, and thinking, I don't know if Russell Wilson's going to be able to sustain this long-term the way that he plays. He doesn't consistently win from the pocket. And here we are half a decade later, and he's still doing it at a high level. Greg Cosell has told this story on this show multiple times. I'm going to retell it here. He's talked to coaches who have coached Russell Wilson, and he brought up a hypothetical play where Russell Wilson makes a read on a throw for a slant that would have gone for 8 yards, but he doesn't pull the trigger. He bails the pocket, he runs around, he makes some people miss, and he picks up 8 yards on a scramble. And so what's the coaching point to Russell Wilson when he comes off the field, when he comes to the sideline? What does the coach say? And what did the coach tell him? He said, we'd probably tell him, great job. And to me, I think that's how a lot of coaches, not every coach, but I think that's how a lot of coaches are starting to look at it now, and it's tough to argue against that. Aaron Rodgers will steal your soul late in the down when things are breaking down for him. He will run around, and then he'll make some guys miss. He'll carve you up with a 28-yard completion on a rope on a scramble drill. And you think of how Carson Wentz has been here in Philadelphia. Some of the amazing things he has done, escaping pressure, making throws outside the pocket. Dak Prescott brings some of those factors. Certainly Deshaun Watson, right? So I can keep going. There are a bunch of guys in the game right now. It's not just about Lamar Jackson and the quarterback run game. And while that certainly can be a big factor and be a big part of the offense, you go down in the red zone, and I mentioned Dak Prescott a few minutes ago. Certainly when they get inside the 25-yard line, he is a factor with his legs. That has been a constant over the course of the last few years. But it's about more than that. To me, I think we've gotten to the point now, and this would have been crazy for me to say a few years ago. I would not believe it if you told me this, but if a guy can't escape the pocket at a high level, I'm one of the many people that wonder if he's going to be able to win in the NFL at all. All that being said, though, I do think I agree with Kurt Warner. You still need to make those throws from the pocket when the going gets tough. You still need to be able to execute within structure, especially in the playoffs, because coaches and schemes, they're too good. They're going to force you to do things that are a little bit tougher. But I do think, though, that there's just been an evolution of sorts, in the way that this position and the way that this game has been executed on the offensive side of the football. There are a lot of ways now that offense can work. It's always been the case, no matter what the skill set has been at the quarterback. Brady Quinn said it, in his interview. If you're a pocket passer, you need the pass catchers. You need the offensive line. You need the run game. You need the defense, right? He said that earlier on. And it's just like that. Kurt mentioned the thought process changes now when you've got a skill set of a quarterback that can win outside the pocket. It's all intertwined, and that's where you start getting into the conversation of team building and philosophy and things like that, which is, to me, I could talk about that for hours, but that's a whole other podcast in itself. And, the Eagles continued to build out that quarterback room with the selection of Jalen Hurts. And to me, I wanted to hit on that here this week, with those interviews from Brady Quinn and Kurt Warner out in Indianapolis. But I went deep into that selection as well as the selection of Davion Taylor, the linebacker out of Colorado, over on this week's Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. So make sure you're subscribed. If you're not already, make sure you go check that out, because to me, it's those episodes this week with Jalen Hurts and Davion Taylor, the one last week with Jalen Reagor. Those are the reasons why you should be subscribed to that podcast all year round, because we're talking about these guys year round. We're talking about who are going to be the future stars of the NFL. And, in this week's episode, talking about Jalen Hurts and talking about Davion Taylor, you get the analysis from us before they were Eagles. So, you can't say, oh, you're only saying that because the Eagles drafted them. This is what we said about these guys before they were drafted. But last week, like I said, we focused entirely on Jalen Reagor. This week, it's Hurts and Taylor. We got some heavy hitters on the show this week. I mean, Nick Saban is on the show. Lincoln Riley, the head coach from Oklahoma, is on the show. Mel Tucker, the head coach of Michigan State, is on the show. So you do not want to miss it this week over on the Journey to the Draft podcast, driven by AAA. Great stuff from Kurt Warner and from Brady Quinn. You can follow both of those guys on Twitter, just like I do, at Kurt13Warner and at Brady_Quinn. And while you're at it, I'm at FDuffy3. That's where I post all the podcasts I'm a part of and all of our X's and O's content that we produce at PhiladelphiaEagles.com. And I greatly appreciate everybody that promotes this podcast on all forms of social media. That is one way to support the show. But the other way is to go into Apple Podcasts or Stitcher, give us a rating, and leave us a comment. I want to give a shout out to a couple of people who did just that. EB Flack left a 5-star review saying how much they love the show. Thank you, EB. And then another one from Coach 48 left a 5-star review saying, how come every team passed on Jalen Hurts? New England had no quarterback. They didn't take him. Pittsburgh needed a quarterback. Didn't take him. The Colts needed a quarterback. They didn't take him. And no team tried to trade up to get him. Well, that's easy to say. The Baltimore Ravens passed on Lamar Jackson once. They took the tight end Hayden Hurst. They just traded a couple of months ago. Every team basically passed on Lamar Jackson. That you could say that every single year. Every evaluation with all 32 teams is going to be completely different. And look how all their teams, how they view their quarterback room is going to be a little bit different, right? You mentioned the Colts. They have an older starting quarterback in Phillip Rivers who only has maybe a few years left here, but they've got a guy in Jacoby Brissett who they love. That coaching staff loves Jacoby Brissett. And, if you're going to go all in and try and win with Phillip Rivers, let's surround him with talent and go. You talk about New England. I'm telling you, all signs are pointed. They've proven it on free agent market as well. They could have signed a number of guys here in free agency, and they didn't. They have faith in Jarrett Stidham and the situation that they've built around him. For better or worse, that's who they're going to ride with here this fall. So, look, you can make that argument all the time. You can say, oh, well, how did every team pass on Deshaun Watson? How did all these teams pass on Lamar Jackson? He went 32nd overall. Every team had a crack at Lamar Jackson, and everybody said, no, it's okay, we're going to pass. So I wouldn't go and say that's why Jalen Hurts isn't going to work because he went in the second round. I think when you look at every quarterback evaluation, all 32 teams are going to look at that completely differently, and all their own situations, all their own quarterback rooms are going to kind of determine whether or not they're going to pull the trigger. So great questions, though. Great comments. Thanks so much to Coach 48. Thanks so much to EB Flack as well for those comments. Thanks to all of you out there for your continued support of this show and all the rest of our podcast offerings on PhiladelphiaEagles.com. All that being said, I think that'll do it. Another show in the books here on the Eagle Eye in the Sky podcast, fueled by Gatorade. For everybody here at the Duffy House, I am Fran Duffy. We will talk to you next week.